Welcome to Conversations at Studios Inc. My name is Courtney Wasson, and I'm the Executive Director of Studios Inc. Today, we'll be talking to Benjamin Rosenthal, a media artist who's currently completing the third year of his residency. Studios Inc. is Kansas City's arts nonprofit that offers pivotal 3-year residencies to mid-career artists. Thank you for joining us. So, this is our now fourth Conversations at Studios Inc. And normally we do this in a podcast style, sitting at the desk, but since we're both social distancing, I'm at my house. And with me is Benjamin, and Benjamin's in studio currently.
Well, or in some sort of ether, some
Yeah,
digital
right,
space.
right. Well, tell people about your background.
So the background is actually it's a composite of animations that come from a couple different works. I made this particular one for Alter's garden party. I was asked by Boy Boy and Bill Hubbard to make something for that party. So I compiled stuff of these torsos that are being stroked, and they have hair on them, and they're sort of like gorgeous Greek gods like caryatids, and they all come from grinder profiles where they were just sort of bare torsos. And so cut off torso. So I was interested, it sort of connects back to my work, my interest in like the queer experience of fragmentation. But this will also be available for donation on the Studios Inc. website, along with several other videos and images for Zoom backgrounds. So people who are tuning in should donate to Studios Inc. And you can take one and use it in your meeting or in your house parties or in whatever sort of circumstances you find yourself online.
Yeah, it's an amazing background to watch. Just that it is the stroking and there's something that balance that we've talked before about human, but also very maybe plastic's not the right word, but non-human at the same time, or synthetic.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that it would be interesting to have you elaborate more about your interest and investigation in the queer experience and when that began for you too.
Sure. I am a member of the LGBTQ community, but I'm also, I think my interest in the queer experience stems from when I became a out member of that community. So I came out only at the edge of 31. At the age of 30, I'm now 35 and a half, right? I came out at a time that I had already matured as an artist. So I'd had this like opportunity. I'd gone through so much work. I'd been through graduate school, undergrad, and been working actively as a professor and an artist in the field. Um, and I'd always been interested in bodies and body-based sort of experience, and challenging and rethinking the body, particularly in relation to technology, which in itself is fundamentally a queer relationship. It's a non-normative body relationship. But in the summer of 15, yada, 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 things happen. And I was in Brazil, and then Iceland, and then I sort of like I eventually came out, and I felt an incredible urgency to explore um, queerness through my own lens as an artist, but with that sort of more mature hand. So like a combination of kind of the angst of sort of teenager coming out excitement with like a refinement. And so that particular, so my interests also were in the way in which I had been forced my whole life to fragment myself.
Mm.
And so I think of queerness as an act of, I think the queer experience is deeply connected to fragmentation, right? And I want to be clear, fragmentation is not compartmentalization, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
fragmentation, there is something that I would call like a slippage between
Mm-hmm.
things. One has to code switch, and you can never, because you aren't straight, right? You're possibly being perceived as queer or gay or or not, depending on what your identity is. And um, you're sort of trying to be convincing, but you're also not, and
Hmm.
you're sort of playing at those edges. And so the crisis of that fragmentation is very different than how people compartmentalize like work and home. But for example, in I live my life in a way where I have a job, and being out in a job is not necessarily safety, right? Versus being, um, and so there's so many different ways in which we sort of attune ourselves, and we have to construct worlds around some pseudo fiction, right, of who we are. Um,
Hmm.
and and so I think that, and queer people are always in the act of coming out, right? They're
Hmm.
always in the act of, but we sort of chop ourselves up, and in my work, quite literally, but also theoretically, we become sort of like chopped up and sort of spread around. And how do you deal with a family? I'm fortunate to have a family that is very deeply, supportive of me, but a family that may not be supportive, and have to be at a Thanksgiving dinner versus being out at a bar in your community. So
Right.
that's a really long way to answer that very initial question.
Well, well, that's what we had talked about before when we discussed this conversation. Is there's a lot of big questions that surround your work, and one of it being that label of queer, too. And I think that that's an interesting thing to talk about as well. Of that definition, it used to be a negative label, and now seems to be very much a positive, embraced way to describe an experience. And I like the way that you have defined it in relationship to your work. Do you think that your work is political?
Yes, I do. I don't think it's. I think actually, the work engages a politics of how we engage and understand the body, and how
Hmm.
we engage and understand sort of different forms of experience. And I think that's inherently political. It's I think as I've sort of come into my own, I make work that is unashamedly queer,
Right.
and doesn't necessarily try to conform to ideas of what that should look like and be like. It is in the by the nature of how I'm making it, and also in the ways in which the images are constructed. And so I find that um, a deeply political act. And as an artist, I think it's a political act to make work that addresses this without being completely self-referential all the time,
Right.
right?
Right.
Which
Well,
I
and I feel like when I come to your work, um, you as the artist, but me as a viewer in a position of question asking, or I don't understand it fully, and I like that uncomfortable in between of wanting to understand it or working to understand it. And then there are times where I wonder, because I don't, or I am not considered queer, if that is, if I'm missing, or if I need to rely on you as the teacher to teach me, because I don't have that perspective.
That's an interesting question, because I think we're talking about legibility of, to some degree, what is legible and what is left illegible,
Right.
right? Which are actually political choices as well, um, in the work. And particularly, I'll use the example of sort of my work when it becomes a multi-channel video installation,
Okay.
which is a format that I'm quite comfortable with, and that is often sort of an outcome from my projects. Um, I'm constructing environments in a way I, that are looking at the viewer as participating in a queer act of fragmentation. So even if one's understanding is, if one is not sort of totally understanding of the exact context, um, of exactly what they're looking at, they are being actively fragmented, and they're being subjected through their body through an experience that that sort of pushes them to encounter the work in different ways. And sound locates you from here, and an image is there, and there's a flash of something, and you have to react, right? Um,
Mhm.
and so there is sort of a non-textual response to that as an
Mhm.
audience, right? That I think artists often devalue, um, and where I think there might be a guttural understanding of what's happening at times. It's uncomfortable.
Right.
There's images that are both disturbing at times and sensual, right? There's sensual natures of things. There's luscious color at times, and then there's like harsh sounds. And so you're being subjected to an environment where you're meant to feel something. Um, and I don't, and while I can elaborate on the sort of like methodology behind everything I do, and I don't actually feel, I think that can be add extra layers to the
Mhm.
experience for a viewer, but I think of art as in the context of poetry
Mhm.
and movement and even though I'm like highly conceptual in my approach to making, it's not just about material. Um, I I really value that sort of like urgent, immediate response in a viewer's pit of their stomach,
Mhm.
because I think that it's getting at what the work is talking about more than if I were to say something. Um, so I often, I mean, the other thing is that I'm in a field where there's a title, and that title, particularly if it's a single channel work, right, that's being screened, that title precedes the film, right, the video.
Yes.
And that title provides some sort of context or some sort of like jumping off point that becomes part of the encounter of the work. Um, and
Well,
so,
and we should explain for viewers too what single versus multi-channel is in video art in case they're unfamiliar.
sure, yeah. So a single channel video is just like a movie that you watch on the screen. It has a beginning and end. It doesn't have to be linear in terms of its approach. It doesn't have to be narrative, but there's a starting point, there's an end point in the viewing experience. And the work is constructed in a way, just like in a movie theater, you would watch it through, or on a television show, you would watch it through, and then you'd experience it in that sequence.
Hmm.
A multi-channel work makes use of multiple video sources and outputs, right? So for example,
Okay.
versus one projection, there might be three projections, which are each considered channels, right,
Okay.
of work. They can be synchronized or not synchronized, depending on the work. But when they're synchronized, things can move between space and across spaces and distances, um, which I find particularly exciting. I mean, I've
Hmm.
done both, right? And it's expensive to do synchronization, but it's so deeply satisfying, like
Hmm.
in the way it works. But it is often spatial. So that doesn't mean that a single channel work can't be spatial and can't really
Right.
be projected single channel in a space on a loop where audiences can enter the video watch and experience a large screen next to their body.
Right.
Um, but multi-channel installations really do take advantage of the idea of space
Hmm.
and space time and the way in which our space, time, and bodies intersect. And so that's actually not the easiest definition. I realize it's sort of complicated, but have I been clear at all?
It has been clear, and it is really helpful, and it allows people who may not be familiar. And I would say um, that there's a group or a group of people in Kansas City that just need more video art in their
I
lives.
think that in this particular time, the idea of making work that thinks about audience and thinks about a myriad of audiences beyond the sort of gallery experience is important. I am exploring some VR stuff online with this open source thing that is driving me nuts because I don't really understand it entirely, and it's really hard. It's a different way of thinking.
Uh,
Um, and but I'm excited about that. I've been resistant to VR because I found it to be a little bit of a privilege box. It still costs about $500 for a VR
Right.
set. And so the idea that this is accessible to people at home is a bit absurd.
Hmm.
Um, it's not accessible to most people at home. I I'm still interested in exploring it because it seems to be a conversation that the work should at least
Hmm.
try to address at some point. And as an artist, sometimes you have to really think, okay, this is an opportunity. It may be connected to privilege, but it's an opportunity that could lead to radically different ways of being that I don't know
Hmm.
yet.
Hmm.
Uh, the platform I'm using, this Mozilla Spoke platform, is an open source platform, and what's nice about that is you actually don't require VR goggles or anything to interact. You can go in like a game and move an avatar
Okay.
around. I mean, the only thing I've built so far is like a shell for a gallery, like a very traditional blue chip looking gallery.
Hmm.
Can put up videos in it, and because I feel like that's the best way to start. But I like the idea of this becoming other weird environments where um, things that I've made, objects that I've made in 3D animation, becomes like objects to encounter. And I'm also looking at how can I disrupt these environments? Like how can I make things that you pass through that are not solid? I'm not sure if
Mm-hmm.
that works.
Yep.
Yeah. Or like how do I make your body enter inside of a sculpture and you're this sculpture, and then
Mm.
like that's your limitation as you encounter the world from the point of view of the sculpture. That kind of interests me too. So, and there are other people I know sort of investigating similar things, and so we're trying to talk to each other about it. But yeah, I mean it's a natural relationship. The idea of those multiple spheres of experience make a lot of sense to me.
I, as you're talking, and we're talking so far about a lot of very technical work, or technology based work. But if someone went into your studio, is you draw, you paint, you sculpt, and then you do your video work, and you do digital prints, and you run the whole gamut. So do you have to do that in order to maintain interest in just maintain interest in your studio practice? Do you like that variety, or do you find that there's spurts of working?
I definitely think there are spurts of working in different ways. Some of the work is really labor intensive, especially the digital work. And so is the sculpture, and so is the draw. Actually, they're all kind of labor intensive practices.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I feel like I need different perspectives as an artist. First of all, I'm identified, and I guess I am proudly identifying as an artist working with media because there's so few people in this region that do, and I think
Right.
it's important for us to be vocal and out. I mean, in general, but
Mhm.
out about
Yeah.
that in public because there are people who are making really great work in that vein, and they're not showing here.
Yeah.
And um, because there really isn't venues to support that, and so and there's no reason why that should be, right?
Right.
There's absolutely no reason why that should be. Um, but there are many people I know. Actually, many of my friends in the media art world come from this region. They live elsewhere now, but they all come, or they went to the art institute, or they did. I have all sorts of connections through this space of dear friends who are at the top of their field, and they don't live here, they don't show here, and they don't. And I think that so I think in a way we have to stand up and be like, this is what I do, even though I've actually always identified myself as an artist working in all materials.
Um, so a running theme through what we've been talking about is one, the other or perspective, connectedness, the idea of connecting either to the other or to yourself, or just the idea of bodies literally being touched or stroked through the hair, which I get to watch the piece behind you this time. Um, and then the work that you were doing with the medical research has been really interesting too. Will you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, I would love to. So, in the fall of 2019, I was awarded a Keeler Family Intra-University Professorship. the University of Kansas to work between the Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies and the KU Frontiers Clinical Translation Science Institute at the University of Kansas Medical Center. As part of this research, I talked to patients and met with doctors, public health public health people, to talk about like the nature of desire in the context
Mm,
of healthcare, and particularly healthcare that may result in prosthesis. And people, what was really powerful about this particular institute is they have a patient-centered focus in one component of it, where they have a whole advisory board of patients who
mm,
who talk about like their experiences candidly in a way that is not being accessed by other what are called CTSAs, these sort of centers for research around the country. That's really one of the strengths of what's happening here in the region,
right.
medically, like incredible awareness of that. And nobody asks people, um, what would you like? They just assume you want a leg and they give you a selection of models. Well, maybe you don't want a leg, like, or maybe a leg
Mm,
is not sufficient. I mean, and there are other areas. It's not such a big leap. Like we think about just in terms of like the home erotic, right? Like the the idea of like sex toys as an extension of the one's own personal or familial erotic experience, right? Nobody asks disabled people like what they desire, and they don't have
right.
conversations with disabled people in the same way that they have conversations with non-disabled people. And so I think that there is that was where a lot of my research was leading, and it's very nascent. And I've been building sort of like ideas for prosthetics, but eventually I'm hoping to sort of workshop these with people who might be interested, like in like people
Mhm.
who are disabled, who might be interested in having conversations about my assumptions, what they find interesting and offensive and not interesting about these things. And I'm really excited about the possibility for like connectedness, right? And how like I think we privilege human to human physical contact,
Mm, mhm.
as being supreme. And that is not an option for everybody,
Right.
disabled and non-disabled. Actually, there's for
Right.
a lot of people who do not have access to that. Many of us are living in this quarantine without access to human contact at all beyond the
Mhm.
screen, right? And so I'm curious about what those hybrid experiences might be like, um, as we sort of move forward. And oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, they may be non-normative. So when you were saying that about the listening to a disabled or non-abled person and their desire, um, in my mind jumped to those leg prosthetics that don't look like a leg. They act like a spring, and they are more functional, and it's what the wearer of the prosthetic desired, was more function and normacy or normalcy.
I agree. I think it's important to, well, first of all, I think that well, I deeply value the kind of respect-based culture that
Yeah.
we've developed, and I think that that has created far more livable worlds for a lot of people.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of listening. There's a lot of talking.
Mm,
Um, and I mean, I think as artists, I'm certainly guilty of that at times. But like one of the best things one can do is just listen. And I had somebody criticize my work who identified as disabled and said, "Well, we have so much further to go than fantasy." And I understand. And from a rights-based perspective, like yes, we do. We have some pretty
right.
big issues, but that doesn't preclude fantasy, and that doesn't
Right.
preclude desire. Um, and I think that using the lens of queerness and queer theory as a way of like creating this relationship, we can open up conversations that would not be possible in medical contexts, right? Because we don't talk about like what it feels like, or urgency, like the kind of urgency like that, like medical professionals refer to, like I'm having a little bit of bourbon right now as we're having a lovely chat, right? This is considered a comorbidity, right?
Mm.
And it's referred to as comorbidity, right? It's not referred to as um, human, right? Or it's not referred to as, and we talk about like, why do people have unsafe sex, right? What is that
Mm.
desire, right?
Right.
That forces people to, and why we have great things like um, medications to prevent transmission of HIV and other illnesses.
Hmm.
Like we like and like Gardasil to prevent HPV. Well, because sometimes just you must, because you feel, and humans feel. And I think when we remove it from medical perspectives and we sort of integrate other forms of thinking, queer thinking, right, that are open to most people, more people, we create space, hopefully in medical professions and in everyday life, for people to really accept difference and consider different desire. Um,
Right.
like we're all like, I think we're all idiosyncratic beings that experience the world in radically different and interesting and challenging ways, right? And so if we can actually come to an understanding, we get that, right? Like we get that like my experience is different than your experience, but what we're connected by in some way, shape, or form is that we experience things as a
Hmm.
that and that we and that encounter is unique and is part of what makes us who we are. And
Hmm.
if we can accept people as they are, right, without creating, without a need to fix them, without a need to solve them, without a need to cure them, right,
Right.
and just facilitate an ability for people to procure or desire or encounter what feels right and just and important. Like, I mean, I think some of the ways in which we distinguish ourselves fall away, and some of those, when they're not important to the individual, and I think we become much closer to an understanding of each other and ourselves, and I think that's something that like art can do.
Your work doesn't feel sexual when the work that I've seen, although it at the same time it is. So it doesn't feel pornographic, but there are things like the sculpture that looks like intestines with a rope coming through. And for some reason, that action of knowing that this rope is passing through this intestine seems very sexual. Or when you talk about desire, when we were talking about desire earlier, I didn't necessarily feel that it initially was a sexual desire. I think that can be, again, a part of what you're talking about, but it doesn't seem like that's the main focus. Do you think that, and this brings back to being a queer artist, that there is an expectation that the work is that is included?
I think that there is an expectation that the work meets certain benchmarks for what counts as like obviously queer and obviously or
Mm-hmm.
obviously gay or obviously and the easiest way to do that is to show queer sex and queer and gay sex. And I'm interested in those things,
Mm-hmm.
obviously, I'm interested in those things. And I am interested in and I'm interested particularly in this sort of technosexuality where like genitals are not necessarily important, right? They don't become,
Mm-hmm.
they're not the only sort of way of accessing intimacy, right? New forms of
Right.
intimacy is maybe what I'm interested in. But I also think that becomes a really problematic cliche among artists where like everything looks the same, and you walk into a show of queer art and it's I mean photographs of pretty boys in compromising positions. We don't see fat bodies, we don't see women's bodies, we don't see non-normative bodies, right, presented in these sort of contexts. And so um, it really feels like a sort of like erotic freak show of like well-endowed pretty people. And at what point does that lose interest, right? At what point do we have to ask ourselves as artists, right, for something different, for something more meaningful or something more challenging? And we are there's a lot of work to be, just like there's a lot of work to be gained in all communities, there's a lot of work to be gained in the LGBTQ community for equality and equity and access to basic human rights. You know, and so there is place for that work. I don't see that as my place. I'm interested in sort of what's the future of bodies, what's the future of queerness. When we sort of remove the sort of binary of gay, straight, man, woman, and we open up this field of possibilities for people, we may be looking, and likely are looking at a world that is fundamentally queer and is majority queer. And there's something about this moment politically, culturally, socially, right, that the idea of like distance and separation and a longing, right? I think there's
Mm.
a joy in that longing and a joy in looking and a joy in, and I think that I feel compelled by that right now. Like the joy I feel in sort of like sitting on the outside and sort of observing and then entering and penetrating. So we'll see.
Thank you for your time. This is the very first. You get to be the first. And again, we'll apologize to the viewers for some of the max headroom type interruptions due to our connectivity or lack of connectivity to Wi-Fi. But I look forward to more talks and hopefully showing more media work at Studios Inc. and just more media work in Kansas City and the region in general. So I really appreciate you, Ben.
Thank you so much.
You're
It's a
welcome.
pleasure. All right.
For information on our resident artists, events, and exhibitions, visit www.studiosinc.org. That's studiosinc.org. The music featured on today's podcast is by artists Barry Anderson and Ricky Allman of Lucite Plains.